In our project folder here, I first of all want to draw your attention to the script which starts our development server. Now, this is only the development server here. You won't use that for production. Here, however, I added this -c-1 flag. What this will do on the HTTP server package is it will ensure that we don't cache any assets using the normal browser cache. Now, you will learn later in the course that there are two types of caches. One cache which can be used by the service worker and the default browser cache. And I don't want to use the default browser cache to make sure that all changes we put into place here are immediately reflected in the browser. Now, for production, this is not necessarily required because you don't change your files every second. Now, with that out of the way, make sure that your server is running by opening the terminal. This is simply a terminal integrated into my IDE, and running npm start. This will then execute the start script and start our server with that please don't cache anything policy. Now I'll close the terminal here simply to have more space. Now with that, of course, we want to create a new service worker. And as I told you, a service worker actually is a JavaScript file. Now you could be inclined to add it to source JavaScript because that is where the other JavaScript files sit. However, do you remember that scope thing I mentioned? That you can define the scope of a service worker and which kind of pages it can actually react to events and control? Well, the scope by default always is the folder the service worker sits in. So if we add it to the JavaScript folder, the service worker will only apply to pages inside that folder. Now, clearly we don't have any in there. The JavaScript files here are, of course, no pages. These are JavaScript files. I'm talking about HTML pages. So the JavaScript folder is the wrong place to add the service worker. Instead, you typically add it in your root web folder. So the folder which gets served by your server, in our case, the public folder. Then you ensure that the service worker applies to all pages in your application, no matter in which subfolder or root folder they sit. If you were to add it in the help folder, the service worker could control the index.html file there, but not the index.html file in the public folder. Sometimes you want that behavior, you only want to control certain parts of your application with a service worker. Sometimes you don't want that. So I will add it in the public folder to be able to use it everywhere in the application. There, I simply create a new file, and you can give this file any name you want. I'll name it sw.js, obviously for service worker. Of course, you could also, as I just said, name it differently. So that's the service worker file being added to the public folder, to our root web folder where our application is getting served from. Before I put any code inside of the service worker, I want to register it. Now, how do you register the service worker? As I said, you do this in your normal JavaScript code. You could add this code to the index.html file with some inline code here between script tags. You could do that. And then you would have to do it in every page though, every HTML page. Because, and that's another important thing, you want to register the service worker in every page of your application because you don't know which page the user is going to visit. Once you registered it, it won't be replaced easily or quickly unless you have a new version of the service worker. But you need to be able to register it from anywhere because otherwise you need to bet on the user visiting a specific page of your app. So, a nice place to add the registration code would be the app.js file because I'm importing this both in the index.html file in the root folder and in the index.html file in the help folder. So I'll add the registration code to the app.js file here. In there, I first of all want to check if the service worker feature is available in the browser the user visiting this web page uses. Because as with all the features you learn in this course, progressive web apps are about progressively enhancing web apps, and therefore we can't bet on service workers being available. It would be nice if we could use them. It's a big enhancement of the web application, but if they aren't, there's nothing we can do. All we can do is we can at least check for the existence to not execute code which won't work. So I'll add an if statement. And there I want to check if service worker, and make sure you get the casing correct, capital W, but a lowercase s at the beginning. If service worker in navigator. Navigator simply is your browser, and the in keyword allows you to check if a property, this property, exists in this object, so in the browser. That means that the code inside the if statement will only execute if the browser of the user visiting the page has the service worker object, which means it supports service workers. Otherwise, this code will just not execute, and we don't add any service workers because it's not supported, but the app will still work, just without service workers. Now, since we know that service workers are available, we can execute navigator dot service worker. The casing is the same as the property we checked here because now we are accessing that property. And on that property, you can call register. And even though I added it in a new line, it still applies to this expression here. I'm just putting it in a new line to make it easier to read. So here we register a new service worker. Now we have to define the path pointing to the service worker, and that will be /swjs. Slash to make sure we always go to the root folder first, and then, well, this is the file name, swjs. This will tell the browsers that support the service worker feature, that this file should be treated in a special way and should be registered as a service worker as a background process, so to say. Register actually returns a promise, and I'll dive deeper into promises in the next course module. For now, you can know that this is simply a feature allowing us to work with asynchronous code. And register is an asynchronous action, which means it doesn't instantly or immediately finish. This registration process takes some time. So in order to get informed once it is done, we can chain then after it. This is a promise feature, and the function we pass to then will simply be executed once the promise is done, so once the registration is done. This ensures that this is not blocking our work. So if I add more code after this if statement here, it will immediately execute because the registration won't block the single thread. And again, more on this in the next course module. Now here and then, I can simply say console log service worker registered, like that. With that, we now have a code which should inform us once the service worker is registered. Let's go back to our application then and make sure that the web development server is running. I just restarted it a few seconds ago. Once we reloaded the web application, I just did this, I do it again, you see service worker registered here in the console, which is great. It means the then block got executed. You'll also see that if you visit application here and you click on service worker, you get some information about the service worker here. This is your scope here, since we placed the service worker file in our public directory. It's the entire domain. Here you see that it is activated and running. And here you see the name. You can click on it to view the file content, which of course is empty right now. Now these buttons here allow you to quickly update it to a new version if you got one, simulate a push event, we'll come back to this later, simulate a background synchronization event, we'll come back to this too later, or unregister it if you want to get rid. These are all debugging, development only tools. You can't rely on using them in a production ready application, of course. The checkboxes up here allow you to simulate offline mode, we'll do this in the future. To automatically update the service worker whenever you refresh the page. I'll come back to what I mean with that soon. To not use the service worker in case you're intercepting requests with fetch. We don't do this yet, but we'll later do it. If you wanted to disable it temporarily, you could check this. And to show all service workers you have, so not just the ones relating to the page we currently have open here. This is the service worker registered. And here you see that it wanted to terminate it because it's not doing anything, but the DevTools prevented it from doing so. Doesn't really matter to us here. This is the important line. Let's next see how we can use the install and activate event and what we can actually do with the service worker.